tourism is the business of providing accommodation and services for a tourist. And tourist is one who visits a place which is not his own place for pleasure or knowledge. And then we also said about ecotourism, which is defined as visiting a place which is pristine, undisturbed and fragile, and which is an alternative to the standard commercial tourism. And that is what ecotourism is all about. Thus, in a place like Ladakh, where the main attractions for tourists are the cultural heritage, flora, fauna, environment, and so on, tourism automatically becomes ecotourism. So tourism in Ladakh is ecotourism, and it's an example of ecotourism. So in the next 10-15 minutes, what I'm going to say are a few points to provoke thoughts. These are not pieces of wisdom, as I'm not really someone who can dispense wisdom on tourism. But even if what I'm going to say provokes one thought, the purpose of this paper would have been served. Tourism is the world's largest and the fastest growing industry. The United Nations World Tourism Organization, UNWTO, maintains statistics on international tourism. And according to the UNWTO, the figures for 2018, that's last year, were as follows. International tourist arrivals, that is, tourists visiting different countries in the world, the figure was 1.4 billion. 1.4 billion people have visited countries other than their own countries. Out of this, India's share was 10.5 million, which is less than 1%. To be precise, it is 0.78%. The annual growth rate, although in India is much higher than the world average, which is 5.2%. The domestic tourists in India, the Indians visiting places other than their own places within India, is 1.7 billion. People keep visiting other places. And the growth is 9.4%. So international and domestic tourism together contribute about 2% of India's GDP. Only 2%. So why is India's share of international tourism so miserably low? Despite her breathtaking cultural diversity and a variety of tourist products. From Kashmir to Kanyakumari and from Nagaland to Rajasthan, the ethnic, historical, geographical, environmental, and cultural diversity is simply mind-blowing. The reason for low international tourist footfalls apparently is the lack of world-class tourism infrastructure, like hotels, medical facilities, cheap and reliable transport and communication facilities, and last and not the least, secured environment, for example, as for available luxury hotels for tourists. It is surprising that Shanghai city in China alone has more five-star hotel accommodation than whole of India. So this is the state of affairs. India is also said to generally lack conducive attitudinal culture for tourism. There allegedly are some deterrents to tourism in India which need to be addressed to improve performance of this important sector. These include the following. Tourist traps, which means places that attract tourists only to be overcharged or cheated. Cheating by service providers. It may not be ubiquitous, but cheating is quite common by service providers. Substandard environmental hygiene, filthy locales as health hazards is one of the deterrents. Arbitrariness in trade transactions. If there is an item for sale, they will say 200 rupees, but eventually they will sell for 100 rupees. These at once put off tourists visiting places. Absence of an effective regulatory mechanism. In some states which are famous for tourism, like in Jammu and Kashmir, we had tourist police, but I think their contribution could have been more negative than positive for tourism development. Impolite service providers, generally lacking etiquette. So these are the deterrents to tourism in a country like India, which has so much of diversity to be shown to the world. Tourism is too delicate an industry to be left entirely to market forces. In the development strategy of tourism anywhere, the challenge is to give proper direction to its growth, so as to see that its adverse impacts on environment and socio-cultural traditions and values of the visited places are minimal. Alongside, conscious efforts are required to be made to preserve the fragile ecosystem and distinctive cultural heritage of places, particularly the exclusive Himalayan region like Ladakh. This leads to the concept of sustainable tourism. Now, what is sustainable tourism? It's also known as the rights-respecting tourism. Sustainable tourism has been defined as tourism that takes full account of its economic, social, and environmental impacts, while addressing side by side the legitimate interests of all stakeholders, and the stakeholders being the tourists themselves, the service providers in the industry, the government and local bodies, and the host communities. Technically speaking, sustainable tourism has to be a Pareto optimality. It's a term used in management generally. Pareto optimal situation whereby its economic operations leave many people better off without leaving anyone worse off. And that is Pareto optimal situation in any way. It enlists informed participation of all stakeholders in ensuring long-term and viable economic operations whose benefits are fairly distributed among all stakeholders in ensuring long-term and viable economic operations. Thus, in a manner of speaking, sustainable tourism is a rights-respecting tourism, whereby rights of all stakeholders are identified, recognized, and addressed. Then there is something known as responsible tourism, which is also known as duty-bound tourism, respecting duties of the stakeholders. Responsible tourism was defined in Cape Town in 2002 on the sidelines of a World Summit on Sustainable Development, which was adopted subsequently by the World Travel Mart, the organization that promotes international tourism. Responsible tourism enjoins upon all stakeholders meaning tour operators, hoteliers, governments and local bodies, and tourists themselves, to take responsibility to make tourism sustainable. It casts upon all stakeholders the responsibility of minimizing negative economic, social, and environmental impacts, generating greater economic benefits to the local people, involving local people in decisions that are likely to affect their lives and life changes, making positive contributions to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage of the visited places and to the maintenance of world's diversity The world's diversity has to be maintained rather than making the world uniform in all respects. Providing more enjoyable experiences to tourists. Being culturally sensitive and fostering mutual respect between visitors and local people. Thus, where sustainable tourism addresses the rights aspect of stakeholders, responsible tourism emphasizes the duties aspect of stakeholders. Between the two, both rights and duties are taken care of to ensure that tourism activities leave places visited better off for host communities to live in and for future tourists to visit and enjoy. And in the process, everybody involved in the tourist industry benefits from the economic operations. The two terms, sustainable tourism and responsible tourism, have by now become an important part of the tours and travels lexicon. The two together constitute the theme of this symposium, namely ecotourism. It is extremely important from the point of view of our future generations that tourism is both sustainable and responsible. And the marketing efforts reflect the principles of ecotourism, which encompasses both ecotourism and sustainable tourism. Hence, in a manner of speaking, ecotourism can be defined also as sustainable and responsible tourism applied together to a relatively fragile area like Ladakh. The tourism development and marketing strategy in a situation of ecotourism has to be more imaginatively formulated. Marketing, as you know, is increasingly being looked upon as producing what sells rather than selling what is produced. So the concept of marketing in business, including in business industry, in tourism industry, is changing. Now, that is to say, marketing is more to do with product development rather than selling available products only. When the two are taken together, product preservation and development takes precedence over product marketing. A good product sells itself is a proverb. For a place like Ladakh, ecotourism in its most reliable is the most reliable USP. The unique selling point of Ladakh is ecotourism, cultural heritage, environment, flora and fauna. These are the unique selling points of Ladakh, and these should be preserved at all costs. And the direction for future tourism should take these into consideration without being flagrantly violated. Now, ecotourism and Ladakh. Ladakh was thrown open to tourism only in the year 74, as someone has already mentioned, and that too restricted only to a few interior areas through what was called inner line and restricted area permits. Close on the heels had come the discovery that the Ladakhi culture and values had, after all, been no less sophisticated than those of the rest of the country and some of the most advanced societies of the world. Consequently, many Ladakhis, and some what might be called Ladakh-loving outsiders, have been asking the local population to resist the so-called invasion of Ladakhi culture by alien ones brought along by visiting tourists. They have been advocating a return to the pristine Ladakhi folk culture and values, but to no avail. Very difficult to do that. Alas, the forces of change have proved to be entirely insurmountable. This is so because once the place has been thrown open for tourism, the local population cannot cut themselves adrift of tourist influences, not so much of the intellectual and moral ideas as of the scientific and technological techniques of living. The ground reality is that post-1947 Ladakh has become a meeting ground of two very distinct sublime cultures, Indian and Ladakhi. And thereby the crucible for a new and hopefully more sublime culture in which the best of both can be said to have been fused. But some may, however, argue the worst of both. The factual position in the resultant combo may be somewhere in between. One would not venture any value judgment at this point of time. Ladakhis of today, particularly the educated lot, are indifferent or oblivious of their immediate past, which has formed the warp to the weft of the incoming outside culture. This is evidenced by the ease with which Ladakhis have taken to the Indian language, Hindi and Urdu, the Indian fine art and music, both folk and popular, Indian dresses, Indian food habits, and the Indian general way of living and thinking. There has been a short-circuiting, so to say, from the Ladakh of yore to today's Ladakh. The resultant is what can be described as an Indo-Ladakhi culture, wherein the Ladakhi vernacular language has become replete with Hindustani words and phrases. Hindustani having become a second language for the Ladakhi youth. Ladakhi folk theatre, Namthar, and folk songs have yielded way to Bollywood films and songs. Ladakhi staples like thukpa, baba and kholak having given way to rice and curries of the North Indian variety. And Ladakhi fogos, male dresses, and mogos, female dresses, having given way respectively to the ubiquitous shirt, pants, jacket and salwar kameez. Thus, before the evolution of Ladakhi society had gone far in the 20th century, the revolutionary impact of the Indian culture was upon it, which, with all its pluses and minuses, has come for mingling with the local culture. The challenge for the Ladakhi of today is to see how best a harmonious conciliation of the two can be brought about, preserving the positive and unique elements of Ladakhi and the Indian culture, values and social mores. Successfully doing so will be the Ladakhi's contribution to a sustainable ecotourism. In sum total, Ladakh of today is a small but a bright and colorful patch of the Indian mosaic that instinctively cherishes all that the Indian nation-state, comprised of a seventh of humans inhabiting planet Earth, stands for. It is incumbent on all stakeholders to preserve and strengthen this unique entity of the Indian mosaic. Successfully doing so will be their contribution to ecotourism in Ladakh. I would like to avail myself of this forum to urge upon the various stakeholders in Ladakhi tourism industry, including the tourists visiting Ladakh from the rest of the country and abroad, to be mindful of the exigencies of sustainable tourism and responsible tourism, and in the process of ecotourism in Ladakh. Thank you very much.